Welcome to our summer teaching series for Picnic Church and for our online service. What we're going to do is a series of short messages on significant scriptures. Now, what we mean by that are passages from the New Testament or the Old Testament that have made a real impact on the lives of some of the people at Westlake. And so I'm going to kick that off today. And to do that, I want to go to the book of 2 Corinthians, where Paul asks a question that in 1988 was really haunting me. He says, reflecting on what God had called him to do, who then is capable for such a task? Well, back in 1988, I was a police officer. Anne and I weren't long married. It looked like we had our life planned out in front of us. But then I began to feel that God might be calling me to be a pastor. And some people in our local church began to say the same thing to me. Wonder if you've ever felt totally intimidated and inadequate for something that you had to do. Well, that's how I felt every time the thought entered my head that God might be calling me to become a pastor. I was answering that question from Paul about who's adequate for such a task by saying to myself and saying to God as well, certainly not me. I felt I wasn't smart enough. I felt I wasn't good enough with people. I felt I wasn't eloquent enough. And so for months, I wrestled with this feeling that God might be calling me on the one hand, but on the other hand, I didn't feel adequate for what he was calling me to do and to be. At the end of the summer, Anne and I were invited to attend what was called in our denomination PALCON, which means Pastors and Leaders Conference. And when we arrived at the conference, we were given, those name badges that you put on. And I thought God was having a bit of a laugh because mine said Reverend James Pettigrew. So I quickly scored out the Reverend. At the conference, there were daily Bible readings led by an American pastor and teacher called Reuben Welsh. And Reuben Welsh one day unpacked a significant scripture that impacted my life and changed the direction of my life. I'm going to read that scripture to you now. It's from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and this is what it says. Such confidence is the confidence that we have through Christ towards God. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant. And in those verses, Paul's answering that question he posed earlier in 2 Corinthians about who's adequate, sufficient, competent to do what God has called them to do. And he says no one is, frankly. He says not that we are sufficient, or some translations put competent or adequate in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us. He's saying, in myself, I'm not adequate. I'm not competent. And boy, did I agree with him on that one. But then he goes on to say we can still do what God has called us to do, despite feeling inadequate by the task and intimidated by it, because our sufficiency is from God, who made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant. And I remember the thought coming into my head, God's sufficiency can make up for my deficiency. God's sufficiency can make up for my deficiency. And Reuben Welsh went on to explain that total dependency on God can overcome our feelings of total inadequacy to serve God. And he explained that God would empower and equip us to do whatever he's called us to do. And what we can't do in our own strength, we can do in the strength that God will provide. And by the end of that Bible study, it was in Blackpool, God had stripped me of all my excuses, and I began the journey which led me to become a pastor. Now, I've got to be frank and honest and say it's not always been easy. There's been so many times in the last 34 years when I felt inadequate and intimidated by what God is calling me to do. In fact, I felt it many times since I've become the pastor at Westlake. I felt inadequate to minister to people from different cultures. I felt intimidated about trying to teach people who are much better educated than I am. I felt inadequate and intimidated to lead a church through a pandemic. When I get those feelings of inadequacy and intimidation, I always return to these verses from 2 Corinthians and remind myself, and remind God too, that he has promised to make me sufficient. He's promised to make my gifts and abilities sufficient for what he's calling me to do. And so that's why this passage in 2 Corinthians is significant to me. But I want to suggest to you that it should be significant to you too. I think there's a problem in how we read this passage. You see, what happens is that people read the passage and they get to the word minister and they automatically think of people like me, pastors, people who serve the church, and they think that these verses only apply to people like me. Well, they don't. They apply to people like you. And I'll tell you why. It's because the word minister there is simply a translation of the Greek word slave or servant. And you'll remember that cliche, which is true, that we are saved to serve. We're all called to serve God. We're all called to be his servants. We're all called to serve him, not just in the church, but to serve him in every area of our lives. So while not all of us are called to be pastors, all of us are called to be servants of God. And that means the principle that's embodied in this passage that makes it significant for me should be significant to you. That total dependency on God overcomes our feelings of total inadequacy in life. Did you get that? Total dependency on God overcomes our feelings of total inadequacy in life. And that applies to us in all areas of our life. Because as we said earlier, we are called to serve God in every part of our life. And so the key issue here for us in our Christian life that's being addressed in this scripture is one of dependence. Are we willing to give up our self-reliance and our self-sufficiency and become dependent on God? I want to end with a couple of questions for you. I want to ask you, what area of your life do you struggle with feelings of inadequacy in right now? What task in life are you currently feeling intimidated by? And here's a final question. How could you learn to live in greater dependency on God in that particular area of your life? And I'm going to pray that this passage becomes significant for you, just as it has been for me.